So asbestos is a complex topic, and my knowledge of it is somewhat limited. So let me tell you, based on my knowledge, what I think in terms of the responsibilities of the asbestos manufacturers. So to begin with, the first asbestos lawsuits were filed by people who worked in factories that produced asbestos. So primarily in the 40s and 50s, asbestos was a very widely used building material. Now, my understanding is that during that period of time when these people worked in these asbestos factories, people did not realize the health risks associated with asbestos. So, and what happened was the people working with asbestos inhaled a lot of this asbestos fiber. It got stuck in their lungs, which 20, 30 years later caused them cancer and caused them a lot of grief and at the end, potentially death and disease. My assumption is, and this is to the best of my knowledge, is that companies at the time didn't know this. Indeed, nobody knew this. Now, can you hold a company liable for doing something, for something they didn't know was bad? And my argument is no. Liability is only a legitimate concept in cases where there is knowledge of the potential harm, and therefore one can prove negligence. That is, that they were negligent or gross negligence, where they purposefully harmed people, or so negligence, gross negligence, or harm, where they actually knew that their workers were being harmed by this, they didn't tell them, and they didn't care. There's no evidence to suggest that, at least not of the original manufacturers. Indeed, the science wasn't there. Nobody knew that this asbestos was harmful, and therefore I don't think you can hold them liable for that. It's sad that these people got sick. It's unfortunate that it happened. But the state of knowledge during that period was such that nobody knew, and therefore they got sick. Now, once the knowledge is there, and they continue to manufacture this, then it's a question of the relationship between the employee and the employer. Does the employee know? Did the employer withhold that information from them? If they didn't withhold it, did the employee agree to work under these very risky conditions in which they might get sick? Did they waive their liability? Did they waive the employer's responsibility? Did they sign something? So there's a lot to think about here. There's a lot of legal issues to resolve around all these. What was known? What wasn't known? Who was responsible? Who knew what when? Was information disclosed? Was this a voluntary transaction, or wasn't it a voluntary transaction? Then there's the whole issue of people who installed it in, let's say, office buildings. They installed it in their homes. What did they know when they installed it? Again, I think most people, when they installed asbestos, didn't know anything. There's also a question of, once asbestos is installed, how risky is it? Are people really getting sick from asbestos in the ceilings? Again, I think there's very mixed evidence. But it's a legitimate kind of legal issue. Let's discover, is there real harm? Isn't there real harm? Is there somebody we can accuse of negligence? Or isn't there somebody? Or is there somebody who really knew this or didn't care about harming people? Was information disclosed? Did people sign a release form? Didn't they? The principle is this. To what extent are the relationships contractual? To what extent is the information known? To what extent is there negligence and harm? And again, these can be complex legally. That's why we have a legal system. But the problem with the legal system as it exists today is that we believe that whenever there's harm to somebody, there's somebody who needs to pay for it. That is, even if you as an employer didn't know you were harming your employees, and more than that, couldn't know because the science wasn't there, you have deep pockets, they are suffering, so we're going to take money away from you and give it to them. That to me is immoral and wrong. That legally is illegitimate. There has to be blame. There has to be fault. Otherwise, you are not responsible. You are only responsible if you could have known, or if you did something purposefully, or you were negligent in not knowing. I think that is the legal principle. But again, there's a lot of gray stuff, and the legal system has to really work on this. What is missing today, I believe, is a real theory of negligence, and of contract law. The other thing that has to be respected on principle are contracts. So, for example, if an employee waived and agreed to work under risk, then they agreed. Then there's a contract, as long as, again, there was no fraud and nobody was lying or cheating on another. So we need a return to respect for contract law, and we need a return to a concept of blame, of responsibility, of negligence, rather than deep pockets, you have money, they don't, suffering, redistribution of wealth. Those are illegitimate.